Welcome to the second of our lecture and speaker series for Liberty Amendments Month. My name is Steve Shannon. I'm on the leadership committee of Liberty Amendments Month. And along with my counterpart, Councilman Chuck Anderson, we are in charge of the lecture and speaker series. So let's start, before I introduce Gerarda Cullifer from the clerk's office, let's start by talking for a minute about Liberty Amendments Month. So the Virginia General Assembly designated 4 weeks of the year as Liberty Amendments Month. Liberty Amendments Month is a time for us to focus on the significance and the expansion of freedoms in the United States associated with 4 constitutional amendments in particular: the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, sometimes called the Reconstruction Amendments, and then the 19th Amendment. So the abolition of slavery, equal protection under the law for all citizens, born or naturalized, the right to vote regardless of one's race, and the right to vote regardless of one's gender. So the idea of Liberty Amendments Month came from Mercury Peyton, who's the town manager for the town of Vienna. And he thought about it in the context of a period in which there was a lot of strife in America. And he was trying to find an idea that would unite us and that would allow us to talk about the issue of race in America in a way that was constructive. So the General Assembly passed this resolution, and in the town of Vienna, we thought that in addition to simply having a resolution, we should actually have a month worth of events, education, cultural, celebratory, that focus on these amendments. And the speaker series is one of the things that we're doing. In fact, we have over 30 different events over this 4-week period during the celebration of Liberty Amendments Month 2022. We have a number of dignitaries in the audience today. I'll also let everybody know that this is being filmed. For those who are watching this is being filmed before a live studio audience. I've always wanted to say that. That dates me, but I liked Happy Days as a kid. So I do want to acknowledge that my colleague from the Fairfax Circuit Court, Judge David Bernhardt, is here. You may remember Judge Bernhardt. He was the moderator last year for the Loving versus Virginia panel that we had as part of Liberty Amendments Month. I indicated that my counterpart, Councilman Chuck Anderson, is here. A former member of the Vienna Town Council, Lori Cole, is here. And I know that our town manager, Mercury Peyton, if he's not here right now, he'll be here shortly. So with that, since nobody is here to see me today, let me introduce Gerarda Cullifer. So this is an exciting event because the clerk of court, John Fry, wanted to have the clerk's office collaborate with the town as part of Liberty Amendments Month. And it's a special thing whenever we can have an agency of government collaborating with our town to do something in the context of a celebration that's really important. And so I do want to thank Mr. Fry for that. Gerarda is his deputy. I've known her for years. And also she's legal counsel to the clerk of court. And she is going to introduce our speaker today, Georgia Brown. So with that, Gerarda, please come up and thank you for being here.
Well, good evening, everybody. A warm welcome from the clerk's office of your Fairfax Circuit Court. And it's my pleasure tonight really to brag about my colleague, my friend, Georgia Brown. She's an assistant archivist in our Historic Records Center. I could go through her CV of her incredible accomplishments. It would include her getting her undergraduate at George Mason just down the road. It would include her master's degree from Drexel. It would include her impressive presentations on myths and monuments in the past few years. That's been such a debate and such an important set of resources to us as we talk through these history in the real world. I could say all of these things, and they would all be true about her scholarship and her accomplishments and her research. But I actually want to tell you a story about when I first met Georgia, which was about 2015, 2016. She was getting that bachelor's degree in history from George Mason, and she interned at our historic courthouse, that 1799 building on the judicial campus. She dove into the records, which she's going to share with you tonight, her love for diving into these records. And she gave birth to really what has become one of our renowned programs, which is our Slavery Index. Now, what that initiative, based on her scholarship as an intern, has done is teased out from these original records the names, the personalities, the communities of folks who weren't on the front and top of records, but inside them, sometimes as slaves, sometimes as indentured servants. These people were absolutely in our court records, just not in the traditional sense of grantor or grantee. Georgia, through her passion for all the truth that these records had inside them, was able to inspire us to go forward with that and use our time and talent to start this fantastic initiative, which itself, that Slavery Index, your records, that index that's here in Fairfax, has been paired with an organization called enslaved.org, which is working as a warehouse to pull academic institutions, local governments. In our case, we're the representative local government on that. And all of that work began with Georgia's love for these records. So I couldn't be prouder tonight to talk about this military wife, this talented public servant, this incredible researcher and archivist who is my colleague and my friend, Georgia Brown. And with that, I will have her take you and me on our journey through the records, archiving the path to liberty.
Okay, thank you, Gerarda. That was an amazing introduction. I am the first to admit that I am terrified of public speaking, but I have learned the records over the years, starting in 2015 when I first started going through the will books to start finding people who were enslaved. And so I could talk all day about our records. I do talk about them all day, and a lot of times it will take me 2 or 3 days because I'll go down some rabbit holes and some tangents, but there's so many great rabbit holes to go down. So just talking a little bit about our records, if you're not familiar with our archive, we were the archive for the circuit court, for the only court at the time, beginning in 1742. We have the records from 1742. Most of ours end around 1930. And so visitors to the Historic Records Center, they're often surprised at how illustrative the court records can be and how personal they can make historic events seem if they will allow themselves to be open to the stories within the records. Sometimes people are coming in just for boundary lines. They want to see the deeds. They want to see maybe just go back to like the 1960s and see who owned their house and how much it was worth, because it's probably worth a lot more now. But a lot of times they see that the land goes back so much further, and they'll see the history of the people who owned the land. And sometimes they're not planning on seeing some people who may or may not have been working the land, not by force. We also have many records that you wouldn't typically think would be in the archive. We have what you would normally think, like the deeds, the wills, the minute books, and the court cases that go along with those. But we also, a lot of people don't realize that we were basically the government from the beginning of the county in 1742 until 1870, after the Civil War, when the Board of Supervisors was created. So we have everything from welfare, especially from the time before there was the separation of church and state, to roads, to military records, and I'm able to speak on 2 constitutional amendments today because we hold the election records, and that is still something that is the responsibility of the clerk of the court. We do not work alone. Our archive works closely with the Virginia Room at the library, local universities like George Mason University, we still have interns and researchers. We have one here today that's been here a lot. And some of our not so local universities as well. We work with the local historic places like Historic Vienna Inc. and some of the farms, the national, regional, and the county park services to include archaeology, county archives, and the History Commission. Oftentimes, our records provide the facts, while the other repositories will have more of the illustrative and contextual information like pictures, newspapers, but we still have a lot of stories within just our records. So I'm very excited to show how our records captured and provide real life examples of how when the laws were passed, either nationally or by state or county, they played out in Fairfax County, how they affected the communities and the families. Some of those families that are still around today, I think there's people in the audience who are descendants from those families. And so I've broken this presentation into 4 sections for the 4 Freedom Amendments. But as the records show and the stories will show, breaking history into certain record groups or certain periods of time, specific populations, or certain just locations, it can be very difficult because, as we know, everything is related and everything has an effect on everything else. I also wanted to give just a quick disclaimer, and I've borrowed this from the Library of Virginia's Virginia Untold articles, which are fantastic. The materials in the Historic Record Center contain historical terms and phrases that can be offensive to modern listeners, readers, and researchers. These include demeaning and dehumanizing references to race, ethnicity, and nationality, enslaved or free status, physical and mental ability, religion, and sex. I do try to change some words out, especially when I'm explaining it as a modern person, and try to use the more exclusive language or inclusive language. But I also want to retain the historic accuracy that are in these records and kind of show the sentiment of the time and what led to the changes that came about in our society. So, starting with the 13th Amendment. So what's unique about this in our records, and probably the rest of Virginia at least, is the lack of records that we have showing what happened immediately after the 13th Amendment was passed. We have little to show what happened after a large portion of the county's population, which was 26% of the population in 1860, were suddenly free, which is really the story here. I'll be showing you lots of examples of how free African Americans were accounted for before 1865, but unfortunately there's very little to account for the newly freed people after the mass emancipation in our country. So we often get the question from researchers about how the enslaved in this area learned about their freedom. Did their former owners let them know? Was it word of mouth? Did it begin right after the Emancipation Proclamation, or did some wait until the passing of the 13th Amendment after the end of the war? And unfortunately, we do not know the answer to those questions from our court records, at least. And likely, just like with slavery itself, each situation, each county, each community, each family was probably a little bit different. And what we have to keep in mind is that this all happened at a time when Fairfax County was recovering from the Civil War, and people in the government were figuring out how they were going to do things, how they were going to be a state in this union, and just where everyone was, how they were going to recover financially, structurally, how they were going to incorporate all these new people into society in a completely different way from where it was before the war. And so we have this stark lack of records showing how the newly freed population moved from being property to citizens in Fairfax County. It wasn't like everyone came to the courthouse, everyone who was formerly enslaved came to the courthouse and signed up, just like you would to vote, as they did previously, as you will see soon. So the best way to showcase that is to provide some examples of how both free and enslaved African Americans were accounted for by the court before and after emancipation. Let's see. So behind the text of this is, it's a deed of emancipation for a woman named Sib, who was freed by Jonah Thompson in 1798. And so a manumission is usually, which is through a deed or the last will and testament, is usually the first document that we will have recording a free person. But it's certainly not the last. So in 1793, the Virginia General Assembly passed a law prohibiting the immigration of free blacks into the Commonwealth. And in the same year, the legislature also passed a law requiring all free blacks to register with the local county, the court, every 3 years. Once a free black citizen registered with the court, a legal record was created documenting their status. A formal list or a register of free blacks for each year was kept by the court, and it was copied into the minute books. And then a copy of the registration was given to the individual. And the copies they're generally called free papers. And they were required to carry them around with them at all times, and anyone could stop them and ask to see and prove their freedom. And failure to register could result in fines or imprisonment. So we have 2 of the 3 original registration of free Negroes books. And unfortunately, we're missing the first one, and that is the earliest one that would have some of the people who were formerly enslaved by George Washington and freed by George Washington. But the registration we see here is the bearer here, John Baptist Carter, a dark brown man, 5 feet 7 inches high, about 22 years of age, several scars on the left arm, 1 above and 3 others below the elbow, occasioned by the bite of a dog. No other perceivable marks or scars, is the son of Keziah Carter, a free woman of color, and born free, as appears from the affidavit of William H. Moore on file in my office, 1844 March Court. So this is usually the second document that we see accounting for freedom. And what's really great about these is just the descriptions, and they did the descriptions because if you did lose your papers, you could go there and go to the court and ask for a replacement, and they would look at the description, obviously, and be like, okay, yes, this is you have these scars. But they're really great because that I know of, other than the draft registrations in 1917, I've never seen anything like this. So it's great genealogical information. John Baptist Carter is enumerated again under his mother Keziah in the personal property tax records in 1847. Since Keziah she's the head of the household, she as a woman does not pay the capitation taxes, but she has 2 sons, it says in here, Keziah Carter and sons. And they always write in here FB for free black, which is nice when we're looking for someone and we want to know if they were free or not. And let's see, yeah, so since I couldn't find anything for John Baptist, I was trying to show the progression over time. I couldn't find anything in John Baptist, so I assume that he is one of the sons. Keziah is also listed in the land tax records. She owned 40 acres on which now the Westbriar Elementary School now stands. And so it's helpful, even though that wasn't necessarily to put the FB next to it, but it's helpful for us to track people over time, especially after 1865. So let's see, we'll get into this a little bit more with the 15th Amendment, but interestingly, after 1865, the tax books and most other registers were not immediately segregated. And then obviously they no longer annotated the race in the margins. And they stay integrated until, 1891. And after that point, they stay segregated until 1964. So that kind of shows that the institution of segregation was not inherently natural to our communities. And it was definitely something that came down later. So this document is a list of male-free Negroes between the age of 21 and 55 years old in Truro Parish, which was basically the southern half of the county. And it says it's a delinquent for the colonization tax year for 1852, returned by the sheriff. Said Negroes being offered to sale at the April-May courts of said county without any bids being made. Essentially, if free males were delinquent on property taxes and had no property to speak of that could be collected in payment of this, they would lose their freedom. For white males owing debt to the county, they would try to take property. A lot of times that was an enslaved person that they would take as property. And we would see kind of the same language that they would try to sell them. Sometimes there was no bidder or whatever the situation was. But it's just interesting to see that the threat of enslavement, whether you were free or you were already enslaved, or reassignment was always there for the enslaved person.
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
How is it that they will own property tax if they have no property?
So this,
Is that historic?
so this is the personal property tax or the capitation tax that you would have to pay no matter what. So even if you were just the personal property, I guess, it's just yourself. So even if you had nothing, you still had to pay. If you were a male between the age of 21 and 55, you still had to pay. So yeah, a lot of times that's all they had. They didn't have anything more, but they would take a chair or whatever they needed to take to try to reclaim that money. So for those who were not free before national emancipation, it can be a bit harder to find records of them before and after the 13th Amendment was passed. Often the only names that were recorded oftentimes the only times that the names were recorded with the court is if they were listed in an owner's probate record, like we see here in this inventory, or in death and birth records, which were only recorded for a very small window of time. And that was only if you died or had a baby at that time. So as you can see with this inventory, only some of the enslaved were listed with last names. And as I learned when we were going through the will books as an intern, it's not as infrequent as you might think. There were lots of people who were listed with last names. And contrary to some popular genealogical TV shows, they did not necessarily take their owner's last name. At least in this area, in Fairfax County, most of them already had names, whether they were acknowledged or not, and they were usually different from their owner. So it definitely does make it much harder if they don't have one. Even if I tried to look for Seton and Newton after because they're kind of rare, after the war, and I could find nothing listing them. So there are some gaps or some records that we try to use. Oh wait, this is one more. So this is another record. This is immediately after, in 1866. We did have one sheriff that still put the FB next to names. And so this is another personal property delinquent tax record. And you can see just like how many of them are newly free Black people. And just going through the record, it's at least half, which is not surprising because you've got these people who were formerly enslaved and then all of a sudden they're being placed on these tax records. They've never paid taxes in their life. They've never and a lot of people were struggling right after the war. So it's interesting to see, but we do now have less names for some people who we didn't have before. So some of the records that we use that are post-Civil War are marriage licenses and the voting registers, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And they have some information in there that we couldn't have gotten beforehand, especially if they were newcomers. So I'm going to be talking about Strother Gibson a little bit more in this presentation. We have him marrying in 68 Martha Weir. And so they're both 22 years old. He was born in Culpeper. And so we had questions about where he came from, where his father came from. And because of this record, we know that he came from Culpeper. Unfortunately, and this is not uncommon, we don't know who her parents are. She doesn't know who her parents are. And we don't know where she was born. Okay, so that was a little bit about how we pieced together evidence of the passing. Can you hear me? You can't hear me? Oh, you guys can hear me? I'll get a little closer. How we pieced together evidence of the passing of the amendments and these new freedoms. With the 14th Amendment, we were very lucky to have a case kind of just jump out at us that showed directly evidence in black and white to how it affected Fairfax County. And so, fair warning, I will be repeating this picture in a few slides because I love it so much. This is a picture of the first all-black grand jury in Fairfax County for the case of Commonwealth of Virginia versus Carpenter. They were mother and daughter. They had 3 cases actually against each of them. So in May 1935, L. Louise Carpenter was indicted for arson and for feloniously procuring destruction of her dwelling house with intent to injure the insurer. Her daughter, Mary Lucy Carpenter, was only indicted for arson because she was the one who actually set fire to her mother's home. When the newspaper what the newspaper called a regular grand jury, which was composed of white men, returned a true bill of indictment. Just a second. The council moved to quash the 2 indictments upon the ground that no members of the colored or Negro race served upon the grand jury, which returned said indictments, and that it was not customary to call members of the colored or Negro race for the grand jury service, which motion the court grants in accordance with the decision of the Supreme Court at the United States in the Scottsboro case, and quashes the said 3 indictments against the said L. Louise Carpenter and Mary Lucy Carpenter. And so Judge McCarthy, he issued a writ of venire fascis for a special grand jury of inquest into this case, and he commanded the sheriff thereof to summon 7 persons of the colored or Negro race of this county from a list to be furnished by the judge of this court. And so that is how we ended up with these men. We have representative from all over the county, Ollie Tinner, which you might recognize from Tinner Hill and Falls Church, Alexander White from Sideburn, John Pearson from Fairfax, Henry Page from Fairfax, Otis Wade of Falls Church, James Collins of Merrifield, and Atanapaine from Fairfax.
Was it uniformly male?
It was, and I will get into that in just a second. So Judge McCarthy, he set aside the indictment, ordered a new jury, and this is when we have those men who were selected. And then the special grand jury, those men, they met and they returned the exact same indictment. So we still have the 3 indictments standing against the women. So then we move on to November when the trial actually happens for this. And I don't really we're historians and archivists. We don't really understand how court works. But it seems like they had a different jury for the actual trial for those indictments. And so when they come back for the second in November, the defendant moves to quash the venire fascis or the panel on the ground that the jury was improperly selected and selected from an improper jury list. And it says it's on the grounds that there are only 12 colored people or Negroes and no women on the jury list of 300 from which the jury is drawn. And I believe we get into, they show the list in the actual term papers. We see the list of where they were pulling from, the different places, and then you can see like they had to go through and figure out the race of all the people, and they marked it. There's several of these, and they're marking what's in there. And so they kind of go on to say that although the black population comprises 1/5 of the population of Fairfax County, that there were no women and no African Americans on the list of jurors that was pulled from. And so it looks like they did pull from the voting lists. And when I look at the voting list from this time, there were plenty of women who had paid their capitation taxes, their polling taxes. There are plenty of people on the colored list that they could have pulled from, but they didn't. They only pulled a few. And so they go on to say that the Negroes and women in Fairfax County have been for years systematically excluded from having their name in any fair representation in the jury box. And so then they go on and specifically call out the amendment, which is fantastic. It says that they want to quash it upon the grounds stated in writing that both the defendants are deprived of their rights under the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States and denied the right to be tried by members of her own race because she is a Negro, and deprived of the equal protection of the law and by members of her own sex, women being now qualified voters under the law of Virginia and otherwise entitled to act as jurors, defendant being a woman in distress with a large family of small children. Other women similarly situated could better appreciate her condition than men. So the indictment of arson against L. Louise Carpenter was quashed under those defenses. The other two, Mary Carpenter, her daughter, the indictment of arson went forward, and then the indictment to injure the insurer continued against L. Louise Carpenter. Both were found not guilty by the jury, and I believe, so there was, I think at the final jury, what ended up happening, I think there was like 2 colored men on there, which was not very many, but okay. So that was the end. They were found not guilty. So moving on to the 15th Amendment. Unfortunately, we are missing our poll books from 1870, right after it passed, and 1871. So we do not have the first poll books where African American men were registering to vote. But they do pick up in 1872, and it is really interesting to see how the different areas captured and decided to record the new voters. As I said earlier, the first segregated land tax books were not until 1891. And after that, they stayed segregated until 1964. This also seems to be the case with voter registrations, with only a couple of exceptions. So the 2 decades after the end of the Civil War seemed to be a time of opportunity for African Americans and a time when Fairfax County was moving forward after the war in a way that made sense for their unique communities. So you'll see this is the Centerville district, and what they did right away I don't know what happened in 1870 and 1871, but they have all the white men listed here on the left and all the colored men listed here on the right. When we look at the West End, everyone is in here together. So the West End is, it's Falls Church District. It's over by like Seminary and like Bailey's Crossroads. They have everyone in there together, but then they annotate it to the right of their names. And this is really interesting. I see this happen in quite a few other precincts over time. And it's kind of like the census takers, where it's in the eye of the census taker and what they think you are. In Fairfax County, we have an example, Fairfax Courthouse, which is now the city of Fairfax, we have an example of, there's a man who we know was married to, well, not legally married, to a woman who he worked on a plantation with. She was formerly enslaved. And they had children together. They were considered married. They had like 5 kids together. He has colored next to his name, even though he was a white man who came from Ireland. And then we have other men like Strother Gibson, who does not have that next to his name. It doesn't say white, but he is not listed as a colored man in those. So it's really arbitrary, it seems like, and up to whoever is writing down the polls. And then here is Vienna. This is the Vienna precinct. And this is the same. There were 15 precincts at this time, and 13 of them look just like this. We can pull some of them out. We know who they are. Some of you guys might know some of the names just by the last names of Harris and Gaskins, and there's some honesties. We know who they are. And so it's interesting. It's helpful to know when we're trying to do historical research. It's helpful to know what race people are, but it's also interesting. It's just interesting. So once we get to, these are the 1902, 1903 poll books. And so this is well after the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896, showing, allowing the use of segregation by states and local government. And that's when we start seeing segregation in a lot of the books. And so these are very helpful because, so this is, I believe this is the white section. And then this is the, yes, this is the colored section. This is for Vienna. And this is another one of those records that we use to make connections because they list, let's see if I have this anywhere else, yes. They list their name, they list their birth date, they list their age, and then they list over here how long they've been in the state, how long they've been in the county, and how long they've been in the precinct. And so, okay, yeah, so I'm using the example of Horace Gibson, which we know from his son, Strother Gibson's marriage license, that his son was born in Culpeper. And yeah, I don't know. I looked at this for this record, and I'm actually more confused now because Horace Gibson, he was a man who came here right after the war. He took advantage of that time right after the war where it was this opportunity, everyone was figuring things out. He was a blacksmith. He had been before the war, and he comes here and he sets up a shop with his partner, Moses Parker, in what is now, it's right off Prosperity and Route 50. He is very successful. He makes all kinds of connections. And so a lot of people were doing that. They were using their skills that they had gained when they were in bondage and the relationships they had had when they were working with all different kinds of people. And they became very successful. And because of this, his son Strother was also able to use those connections. He moved to the Fairfax courthouse area, and he ended up living right next to one of the clerks of the court. And let's see if I'm getting that. Oh, yes, here we go. He must have been a very dynamic man. He had all kinds of connections. If you see his obituary, he was heralded as a wonderful, wonderful man. And he was because voting is not enough. He was elected to the Republican convention as a delegate in 1892. So, and we see this with women. It wasn't enough just to be able to vote. They wanted to get elected, and they wanted to get involved with the process as well. Okay. So, last but not least, the ladies. And I wanted to include this in here because this is the clerk of the court. This actually was one that, whoops. I'm going the wrong way. This is F.W. Richardson, the clerk of the court, and he actually lived next door to Strother Gibson. The women, huh? Yes, so that's our records room. This is still our records room today, and it's just really cool to see them in there, and it's like the same layout, and the lights are in the same place. It's so weird. But the women have been part of this court from the very beginning. They may not have held all the titles, but they've been the backbone from the very beginning. That's, if you know Germantown, and Germantown Road, that's Edna German, which the family, that was what that road was named after. So, following the passing of the 19th Amendment, the Virginia General Assembly passed an act saying, all the provisions of law in any way concerning elections shall be applicable to the registration and voting of women in the like manner and to the same extent that they are now applicable to the registration and voting of men. And the women in Fairfax County, they embraced their newfound right, and they showed up in droves to register to vote. Like when we look at the 1902, the registration, it starts and there's like a few men in there. And then it's just like the pages fill up after that with all the men who are running in to register. So, and we see some familiar names. I forgot to talk about, during the time right after the war, there was a lot of men, there was a lot of Northerners who had come down and settled, and they were trying to, a lot of them had been abolitionists, and they bought up and sold a lot of land to African-American families. One of them was O.E. Hine, who settled in the Vienna area. And then there was a group called the Joint Stock Club. That was a group of wealthy African-American men right after the end of the Civil War who were purchasing large amounts of land, selling to African-American families with the intent of their sole purpose was to increase black land holding in Fairfax County. So we have Alma Hine, who was married to O.E. Hine. They were definitely mover shakers in Vienna and Fairfax County as a whole. She's listed as a farmer and a householder, but she was so much more than that. After her husband died in 1899, she took over his real estate interests, and she matched his successes and well into the 1930s with land development. We also see, Mary E. Henderson. If anyone's familiar with Falls Church, that is Mary Ellen Henderson. She was a school teacher at the Fairfax Colored School. Because, of course, you can't see the top of this, but this lists race down here. So this is all ditto marks for white, and then this is the colored section, which in this one, there's not that many in the colored section, but in a lot of those pages, it's tons of them, like half of it. So this is not a good example, but we've got some great people in this one. And so, yeah, so she's registered there. The middle school at the City of Falls Church is named after her, and both my children attended that middle school. Let's see, what's that one? Oh, I know I have this one on here. This is Mary Carpenter, the one who was indicted for arson. That's her registration in 1920. That's why I have that one on there. Okay, so in tandem with suffrage, women jumped on the chance to be actively involved in the administration of elections. Our voting records show women being employed as registrars at the Fairfax precinct starting in 1920. So here we have this page on the right, Florence Jodesi's statement to the Electoral Board and Board of Supervisors for the Thompson precinct, and it outlines some of the duties of the poll worker, and it shows that in order to secure a correct list, Florence spent a considerable amount of her own time and money verifying legal records recorded in previous registration books. She was paid 5 cents per name removed from the register and 10 cents per name added outside the official registration day. She was extremely diligent. Florence paid to advertise in the local papers to encourage residents to check their registration status. As Florence reported to the Electoral Board of Fairfax County, many hours were spent in this work for which no compensation can be given. This service has been gladly given. So small precincts lacking municipal buildings often had their registrations and voting locations within local stores. We have the Lydecker / Friedman store here in Vienna. In Mount Vernon's Pullman precinct, this was E.B. Pullman's store, which stands for Edith B. Pullman. Her father and her, they built this store, her father Charles, and it was the store that provided general supplies, farm feed to the rural population. Let's see, they opened their store in 1910, and in 1920, at the age of 27, Edith went on to become the registrar for Pullman's precinct. She registered herself and her sister, Irene, to vote, as we can see in this one here. She wrote the registration on the back of her company writing paper, which we can see the letterhead up here. And at this time, the Commonwealth paid registrars $3 per day for their services on registration day, and she was paid $2 for room rent of her store for elections, a sum she received every year until she lost the store during the Great Depression in late 1929. So just as with men, the women did not stop just with the right to vote. They wanted to be involved, and they also wanted to be elected themselves. I wanted to find some really great examples, just like Strother Gibson being a delegate, but unfortunately, we have not processed up to that part when it comes to our term papers, or stop around like 1912. So we will find them, and hopefully we'll get to come back and talk about what we find in the first people elected. I did just find one the other day from 1935 for Ann Woodhouse, who was elected as the clerk of the trial justice court for Fairfax County, and she took over for another woman, Ellen Sheely. So yes, please stay tuned on that. Okay, so that's all I have for mine. I want to thank you for listening to me. And I have to put in our plug for our record center. Please follow us on Twitter. I may know who runs that. We have resumed our Friday 3 o'clock courthouse tours. So please come. We will show you the court room, and then we will show you all the documents, more than you could ever want to see. We'll find your whole family. And then we have found in the archives, we have some information about how to sign up for that. That's a monthly newsletter that we send out, just highlighting all the cool stuff that we find. And then that's the rest of our contact information. Yeah.
I'm particularly curious to look at the records or archives and wondering if you know about them, if of homeowners associations, and if there's documentation, particularly of redlining in those homeowner associated documentation in Fairfax County.
Yes.
And I'd love to,
Yes, that's very popular topic right now. We've been working with lots of university researchers who are looking into that, doing some big, really cool projects. Actually, the county is starting to look into some of that. So at the time when subdivisions started being built, they would always have a deed of dedication, and it would lay out all the rules, and then it would have like the plat that goes along with it. And so that's kind of what is now the homeowners association, like the rules. And so a lot of those, and it's interesting because it doesn't start until a little bit later. It doesn't start until until like the teens, 19 teens, maybe 1920s, that they start putting that in there. But yeah, I said that I'm going to change my middle name to Doctors and Covenants, because it is a thing that like I did not expect to learn about, but I am starting to learn. Yes, we have tons on that.
Yeah, so they don't necessarily, I'm Heather, I'm the historic records manager. They don't necessarily refer to that as redlining. The term that is used in our court records are called restrictive covenants. So you want to look for the covenants of a deed of dedication for a neighborhood. Now, usually you will find them in the neighborhoods themselves, but anybody could restrict selling to non-Caucasian individuals, and the names do change over time, or at least the referral to the race. Sometimes they're referred to as those of the Ethiopian race, Jewish race, and Black or Negro or colored race. But that's a very hot topic right now, and like Georgia said, we are working with several professors who are doing investigation on that currently.
Oh, sure. How big was Fairfax County? I mean, we have the, Loudoun County and I think it's Prince George County. Back then, were they smaller counties, or was Fairfax much larger?
Well, I mean, Fairfax County during the 18th century was significantly small. The population of Fairfax County around the time of the Revolution was about 5,500. 1,500 of those individuals were enslaved persons. And then when you get around the time of the Civil War, it's about 10,000. Around the time of World War I, it's about 20 to 30,000. We don't really get that population boom until after World War II. I think Georgia has some stats.
Yeah, I do. So yes, the time you were very close. So it was in 1860, the total population was 11,834. 672 of those were free blacks, 3,116 were enslaved, and then 8,046 were free whites. But that may just be people above a certain age, but.
Yeah, that's going to be, so those numbers are taken from taxation. So that was the only way to really do that population count, was taken from taxes. So by the time you get to the Civil War, enslaved individuals were taxed at the age of 16. During the Revolution, during the 18th century, taxable property, personal property is at the age of, I'm sorry, I'm going to backtrack that. In the 18th century, taxable property for enslaved persons is at the age of 16. By the time you get to the Civil War, they've backed it back to 12 because they can start making money sooner on individual persons. So it is our census, quote unquote, numbers come from who appears in our tax rolls at that time. But very rural, incredibly rural. I mean, now our population, I think, is 1.2 million, I think, is the population of Fairfax County now. So incredibly rural.
But I actually meant physical size.
Oh, physical size. Well,
These baked in
which time period are you referring to?
How soon were the county borders?
Okay, so Fairfax County used to include Loudoun County, and it used to include Arlington and Alexandria. So Loudoun County, the way we know Loudoun County now, splits off in 1757. And that basically retains its own shape. That does not necessarily change. There's a little bit of change up on Difficult Run in the 30s. And And then the Residence Act is passed in 1790, which forms the District of Columbia. Alexandria and most of what we now know as Arlington, become part of the district. Stays that way until 1847. That's when the Virginia secession comes back. And so, I mean, basically anytime after about 1790, Fairfax is the shape that it is now and the size that it is now. There's a little bit of change with the West End in 1952, then when the Alexandria border changes. But since about 1790, Fairfax County has been what it's been, with a little bit of property taken from Alexandria in 1952.
Can you click back to the will that had the names of the slaves?
Oh, the inventory? I can go that way. Okay, faster. Forward. Yeah. Let's see. That was not a good idea. Oops, there was. That.
Yeah, that one. The right-hand column, is that the value?
Yes. And this is going to be Peter Gooding's inventory, and this is right around the time the Civil War starts. But that on the right is their individual valuation. And I'll point out something that Georgia maybe didn't get a chance to talk about. At the top, you're going to see Tom Fox. Tom Fox was the patriarch of this family. His wife was Harriet. And we know this because in the Freedmen's Bureau records, the Freedmen's Bureau bank records, in 1867, Harriet and Tom apply for assistance from the Freedmen's Bureau. And on this, they've listed their former masters. That's the phrase that they use on the form, or the Goodings. And that Harriet had given birth to 16 children together. And so they had a family of 16. And that by the time that they were asking for assistance, she had 11 children who were living. So quite a few of these children, these people here, we suspect that this was part of this was their family group. Even though some of them are enumerated with their last name Fox, they were most likely all Foxes. So the Freedmen's Bureau records is also a great source as well, at least in the early years.
So there's obviously some connection of age to value.
Yes.
But there are some that are outliers, as if these people probably had specific skills or something that's
Yes.
not really just reflected in their names.
Correct.
There's a lot more behind this than just a name and a number or a valuation.
100%.
Yes. And sometimes they do, not in this example, but sometimes they do explain the reasonings. They will, if there is like the blacksmiths, carpenters, they will explain like why those are usually huge values. And then sometimes they will have like physical disabilities, things like that. So a lot of times they will explain it, just not in this example.
So if we could stay on this slide, how often would there be a recalibration of taxable property, if you will? And who set the rate for this? Was this set by the recorder for the courts, or how did that come about?
It was not set by the court. It was not set legally. As far as we know, it's not codified. Just like everything else, it's driven by the economy and by demand and supply. And so that's something that's very interesting in the court records. Is valuation is similar across the same years, same periods of time. But it can vary. An 18-year-old man in one inventory can be valued less or valued more than an 18-year-old man in someone else's inventory 6 months later. Why is there a differentiation? That's something that we don't understand. And we don't really know a whole lot about. As far as your question about the assessments and how those change over time, just like anything else, as we're currently experiencing now, change happens during major economic events and depressions and during times of war. So especially during the Revolutionary War period, there's two things that happen during the Revolution. The blockade happens in Virginia. We are also no longer doing business with the Brits because we have revolted. So we are no longer importing enslaved individuals from Africa, from West Africa, from the Indies. And the valuation, these individuals then go up tenfold. So a person who might be valued at 200 pounds sterling English currency by 1781 is valued at 12,000 pounds sterling currency. The inflation, because there is no longer supply, normal supply. And then, in the 1830s, there's an economic depression in Virginia. The valuation goes down, goes up. And so kind of during these economic periods, that changes.
And then one more process question. How do people research into the records, and do you keep a record of research projects that have been completed and that are ongoing so the community might begin to know more about them?
No, I'm kidding.
I mean, they're in our brains,
Yeah.
yes.
But yeah, a lot of time, we do keep patron requests. So we know if someone was looking into the reason I have this up here is someone was asking about the Fox family, and I was doing research on that, and a lot of times as I said, everything's connected, and we'll be looking at one thing for one reason, and then it'll come into the other. So we have it. Major projects will have their own folder in our computer system, but then we just kind of know who's looked at who. And I just wanted to answer your question about the timing, how often this was done. It was only done, and that's why there's only one of these, if you were enslaved, if the person who owned you died, or if you were transferred, that's the only time it was done. So there's plenty of people who were never captured,
Right.
because when they were owned, they maybe died before this happened, and so we have no record of them at all.
So that's the issue inherent with researching enslaved persons in the courts, is because they only appear in court records if there is a reason for their enslaver to bring them to court. So whether they're victims of crimes, or they're perpetrators of crimes, or they have been freed, or they are suing for their freedom, or they're being taxed, or their owner is asking to make them tax exempt, which is very common in our court records, or their enslaver has now died, and there is an accounting that is being made. When we all die, we have an accounting made of all of our property, right? So there inevitably are people who are going to be born and who have died before that has happened with their enslavers. But we have almost 40,000 to 50,000 names in our slavery index for enslaved individuals alone, which is a significant portion. We feel confident it's a significant portion of the population that's captured, but there's probably a good 50 to 100,000 more people that maybe never got captured in any court record in any way, shape, or form since the founding of Fairfax County.
Are there records of people who fled slavery, and people asking for a tax break because my slaves ran away?
Yeah, sure. Yes.
It's sometimes, usually that is
sometimes.
more in the newspapers than with the court records.
Yes. However, and again, it's difficult to say. It's a difficult topic. But in the instances where an enslaved person was accused of a crime and convicted of that crime, and was executed for that crime, the court, actually the General Assembly in Williamsburg and then Richmond, was legally bound to compensate that enslaver for that quote-unquote lost property. So we do have instances of that as well. In fact, George Mason IV had an enslaved man named Dick who was convicted of theft in the 18th century, and he died in sheriff's custody, although he was sentenced to be executed, and George Mason was compensated 200 pounds for him.
I have two quick questions. So you mentioned 1830, and what we know is that transatlantic slave trade was illegal. That didn't stop the United States from interstate trade. I'm wondering if there is documentation, as we're talking about this as property, of the exchange of sale as part of those interstate sales in the 1830s. And then also a quick question about, we know that like Freedom Hill were 3 slave owners. Do we have specific data on slave owners in Fairfax County? And did they keep records themselves that you're privy to? And then just one last quick comment, not a question, but we do know from the Library of Virginia research that's been done that Virginia had the most number of slave holdings in the South, although maybe not the same as per capita of others states. Virginia was the largest slave-owning state in the.
Yeah, and I mean, 3 of those people in Fairfax County alone were Robert Carter III, George Washington, George Mason, and John Parke Custis. Of them, between the 4 of them, I mean, John Parke Custis alone enslaved over 300 people. So the documents about interstate lines, those are called certificates of importation. And so certificates of importation were required to be filed at the court. So essentially what happened is that if you were transporting enslaved persons from North Carolina or from Maryland, you had 6 months to record, to declare your enslaved persons in your local county court, that you had not purchased them from the West Indies, that they had not come from Africa or the Caribbean. If your enslaver did not declare you in court, in open court within 6 months, you could sue for your freedom. The enslaved person could sue for their freedom. And so we do have several cases where the enslaved person has been appointed a Commonwealth's attorney to represent them. They could sue under the status in forma pauperis, so essentially as a pauper, as someone with no property, and win their freedom because you needed that certificate of importation. Our certificates of importation are recorded in our deed books. Other counties, it might be different, but ours are recorded in our deed books. And I'm sorry, I forgot the second thing.
Do we have specific data on slave owners in
Yeah.
Fairfax County?
Yeah.
They keep records and parties privy to them. Some of those were kept as family documents.
So we have the ones that we created as part, that is a big portion of the slavery index, is we have the people who owned people. But as far as those, unless it was introduced as evidence in some sort of case, we don't normally have that. And I mean, I know George Washington had his own records that we don't have, but I don't know.
So as far as enslavers' ledgers, right, their own, the plantation owner or the overseer's ledgers, actually a lot of them have migrated out of Fairfax County. There's quite a collection at the New York Public Library, the Ho family, or Ho family, however you pronounce it, the Ho family store account ledgers, which represent their accountings for their homes and their enslaved persons and those people doing work. The Mills family built Shooter's Hill, Shooter's Hill was there before the Masonic Lodge. Those ledgers. We have a Ho ledger at ours, which has their list of enslaved who were born and died. That is a large part of the record, unfortunately, that is missing, is the individual plantation overseer ledgers, besides George Washington's ledgers. He was obviously a diligent record keeper. So, I mean, I can definitely connect you to my connections if you'd be interested.
Time for one more question.
And we're happy to take questions after, too.
Hi. Hi. These 2 people are just wonderful for any kind of help that you need. Through the years, as I've had the opportunity to work with them, I want you to be aware of one thing that they have taken advantage of doing, which I wish the Virginia room would do, but don't have the staff to do such a thing. They have gone through and they have scanned book after book after book. So when you go there and you find something, you immediately turn to them, and for $1, they can send you the PDF or give you the document. And it's a big help. And whenever they don't, of course, then instead you have to take a picture yourself, and I have now figured out a way that when you take a picture, you can change it to a PDF or a Word document, but it's much more efficient. So I just want to let you know that they have done this for years, and they have a tremendous amount more to go, but it's one of the best run Fairfax court historical record centers that we have. And so just be aware when you go in there, you're going into a really good outfit, good group. Thank you for all your work, Heather and Georgia. I really appreciate it.
Hi.
Thank you. Again, I appreciate you, Georgia. We have talked before.
Yes.
It's interesting seeing my family up there. That was very cool.
Yes.
But I want to ask you about Gibson. You talked about Prosperity in 50. Where is that today?
Where he was?
Where is that property today? Does it still exist? Do you know?
So he was, I've been working with George Mason on this area right outside of where George Mason University is. So they had that whole area, like the School Street area. So I don't actually know which house was exactly his, but I know they were all right there.
So you said before Prosperity in 50 with the
Oh,
location.
you're talking about Horace Gibson. Yes,
That's right.
sorry. Yes, so it was published in a book that it was right on, that he had basically started that road, but we have now figured out it was a different road that's over further. I can show you where it is, but it's a road that's no longer there.
Right, and does it exist today, do you think, that area?
It does, yes, it exists. His blacksmith shop is gone. But, and we'd done the Hopkins Atlas, so we can show you exactly where it was and match it up with what's there. I think there's like some sort of like fire station or something right there.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah.
And just real quick too, just before we sign off, we have swag. We have bookmarks and pins, our cards, how to sign up for County Archives tours, informational brochures, copies of the records. So please come up and talk to us, grab some bookmarks, old-fashioned bookmarks, things like that. We'll be happy to talk to you guys.
All right, well, thank you very much to our archivists who presented tonight. Thank you very much for the Office of the Clerk of Court. This was a great presentation. I do want to acknowledge Councilman Ray Brill is here. I failed to mention him at first. I want to thank all of you for being here. And I do want to announce next Wednesday in this very room at 6:30, we're going to have our next presentation. It's titled Documentary and Discussion, Race, the Power of an Illusion. And there will be a video, and afterwards there will be a discussion led by the Fairfax County Chief Equity Officer, Carla Bruce. So we have flyers in the back of the room at the table if you'd like to take one and sign up. And also, the archivists are going to stick around. If you want to ask particular questions, please come up to the table and take a look at the documents. Again, thank you all for supporting Liberty Amendments Month. Thank you.